Ma'am, we can start now.
A very good afternoon to all who have joined this webinar today. On behalf of ELTAI India and the Simla chapter, I welcome you all to this 30th edition of the webinar series. The pandemic has been both limiting and, if I may say, liberating. I'm sure liberating is not a very good word to use here, but liberating because it has brought us together in newer, more unprecedented ways. We are engaging more aggressively than ever without having to fuss over the logistics of physical travel and the nitty-gritties of organizing events. Literature, in the meantime, has kept us all going, even in the darkest of times. It has brought us together in the loneliest of months, and ELTAI has been committed to keeping the spirit of Can we play the video? Thank you so much, Pradeep. Today we meet to discover and appreciate Louise Glück, who has won the Nobel Prize for Literature 2020. I'm sure all of you have come here with some basic introduction to who she is. Google has brought us to her world with much ease and elan. I still take this liberty to introduce her to you before the speakers take us on a special date with her. Well, Louise Glück is an American poet born in 1943 in New York, and she now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As a writer, she made her debut in 1968 with Firstborn, which is a collection of poems, and was soon a recognized name in the literary circuit. She has since published 12 collections of poetry and some very pertinent essays on poetry. Considered among America's four
Ma'am, we are not able to hear you.
You're not able to hear?
Yeah. Your voice is breaking, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
All right. So, considered amongst America's foremost contemporary poets, she's dabbled with a variety of rhetorical styles other than the lyrical poem, which of course remains her forte. Gluck's early books feature personae grappling with the aftermaths of failed love affairs, disastrous family encounters, and existential despair. And her later work continues to explore the agony of the self. Because she writes so effectively about disappointment, rejection, loss, and isolation, reviewers frequently refer to her poetry as bleak or dark. Stephen Burt, reviewing her collection AVERNO, noted that few poets, save Sylvia Plath, maybe, have sounded so alienated, so depressed, so often, and rendered that
We are unable to hear Dr. Kamani.
Ma'am?
Oops. You're not able to hear me still?
Now we are able to hear you.
Okay. So in 2003, Gluck was named the 12th US Poet Laureate. In addition to the Pulitzer and Bollinger Prizes, she has received many awards, including, of course, the latest Nobel Prize in Literature. Currently, she is the writer in residence at Yale University. So that's the poet we're meeting today, and I choose the word poet over woman because she transcends gender. Taking us forward on this journey, we have a panel of 3 prominent speakers, the first of whom is Dr. Guru Raj. Dr. Guru Raj teaches at the Regional Institute of English, South India, Bangalore. He's a creative writer, he's a translator, and a lexicographer. He's the author of 18 books, no less, and has the unique distinction of being the editor of the English section of Vachan.
Yeah, we are unable to hear you, ma'am.
I'm so sorry. I think there's some problem with the internet. I think I'm just going to hand over the stage to Dr. Guru Raj, who's the first speaker in the line today. Dr. Guru Raj, please, we welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the welcome, ma'am. And your friends, good evening to all of you. How wonderful it is to come together so quick when the Nobel Prize was announced to Louise Glück. And most of us, maybe from India, we had not heard of Louise Glück. Not much. Maybe there were a few translations, and Indian literature has published a few translations. And apart from that, not much talk about Louise Glück from America. But when the award was announced, Nobel Prize was announced, people started searching for her. And views related to her poetry were, compared to the other writers, although they were less, but the responses of the people and responses of the people who have really read her literature had been so amazing and so wonderful. And it is in this context I too came across Louise Glück. And when this offer came to me to talk about Louise Glück, it was blessing in disguise, because being a translator, I love to read literature from across the world. And when I started reading literature of Louise Glück, her poetry, and some of her prose pieces, I felt it had been an amazing journey with Louise Glück. So before I talk anything about Louise Glück, I would like to take you to one of the quotes by Khalil Gibran. It matters a lot in the context of Louise Glück, because all of poetry is not just the search but the representation. As Khalil Gibran says, poetry is a deal of joy and pain and wonder with a dash of the dictionary. How beautiful is that? I really love the first part of it. Poetry is a deal of joy and pain and wonder, which is more true in case of Louise Glück. And as she herself says, she has lived experiences of childhood and of the later stage. Louise Glück says, we look at the world once in childhood, the rest is memory. It's true. When we read when we read through the poems of Louise Glück, we understand how true it is. And whole of her poetry, it has the traces of some pleasant childhood, and later it's almost a kind of dark childhood. We in India, or most of the people across the globe, we tend to go back to our childhood. But probably here is a person who doesn't want to go back to the childhood, for it had been so dark, so heavy on her probably. And what is that memory? And what makes a childhood, when the whole world craves for going back to childhood? What is that Louise Glück is slightly heavy for childhood? That we shall understand once when we just peep into the poetry. There is a saying that we don't need to know the background of the writer. Not much is required, or the biography of the writer, when we are reading or understanding their text. We need to see the writer through the text. That's absolutely right. But the thing is, when it comes to poetry, it plays a different tone altogether. Because poetry seems to be so personal, although it is it comes as a fragrance to the outside world. It is so personal, and it is written in highly intense instinctive attempts. And it is because of that, most of the experiences of the writers get reflected in poetry. And that is the reason knowing about the background and the life or the biography of the writer would certainly be useful. And especially it is more true in case of Louise Glück. And when it comes to Louise Glück, she had a wonderful family background, where the father was a businessman and mother was a homemaker, and she was very much interested in art, and father was interested in literature. How wonderful combination it is. And probably that is what makes Louise Glück more sensible and more intense in her expressions. It is because her father was writing doggerel verses, and mother was very fond of art. And not surprisingly actually, proudly, Louise Glück picked up both poetry and art. And she found both the medias helping her to express, but later she took more to poetry rather than leaning on art. And Louise Glück, from at the very early stage, she learned to write. That's very, very interesting thing. At the age of 4 or 5, she says, she shares her experience in an interview and says that at the age of 4 or 5, she started reading literature. That's so amazing. That's so surprising. And she started reading a little block by William Blake and other writers. It is because there was an exposure. With her sister, she explored a number of works, and bedtime stories fixed her imagination. Where the journey into the world of imagination and the journey into the world of mythology, that gave her a lot of creative dimensions for thought. And she started writing very early, she admits, and her father would print them with illustrations. And it is a wonderful collaborative production at the very early age. Even before she was 13 or 14, she started producing her poems with the help of mother, father, where mother would paint for her illustrations and the father would print them. And that had been collaborative production. And she submitted her first book at the age of 13 or so, but it was rejected from a magazine. But she continued sending her poems, and later she stopped sending, but people started asking and picking her poems from different sources and started publishing them. So that is how the journey was. And here I would like to draw our attention to one important thing, where how important it is for children to have some examples within the family, where we ask our children and we blame most of the youngsters for not having inclination toward literature or reading or some kind of thing. But do they have that circumstance? Do they have that ambience at home where they take to these kind of things, what we need to think of? And Louise Glück, she read A Little Black Boy with without any historical background, but she was able to sense the pain. And throughout the poetry of Louise Glück, we say heavy pain, and that's the reason Dr. Kameni was telling it. It is a kind of dark literature, dark poetry, bleak, heavy on readers, because there is nothing artificial. Even though there is imagination, it is blended with reality in most of the poems of Louise Glück. And when she read William Blake time and again, and she says she has read many a times William Blake and other writers, including Shakespeare, where she by-hearted most of his verses and enjoyed the poetic creation. But at the same time, she had her own doubt, like what purpose do they serve in a play? And when it comes to William Blake, she read him many a times, and she says she not just read his literature, she heard every cry that is hidden in each of the poems of William Blake. And later she was engrossed by Roman and Greek literature, where the father was very fond of reading such things, and as bedtime stories. He narrated number of these stories, mother narrated number of stories, and also the grandmother narrated these stories, W.B. Yeats, Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson. So all this gave her a kind of collective experience of the whole field of literature, and that took forward. But at some point of time, especially when people arrive at their teen age, there are many distractions. And in a country like America, we can imagine what it is. And there, she wanted to be an actress, and she wanted to be applauded. And when she wanted to be applauded, she wanted to be a performer. But the thing is, the greatness lies, or the success lies in a person when we realize our limitations and strengths. And that realization came to Louise Glück when she wanted to be a performer. And rather, instead of I explaining what actually made her that realization and understand her limitation and strength, let us listen to Louise Glück herself. Here we watch a small video.
It was one of those sort of child dreams that oftentimes gets knocked out of the child and replaced by something else, sometimes something equally grand. From the time I had that little poetry competition in my head between Swanee River and Little Black Boy, always, I knew that what I wanted was to write. And I digressed occasionally. There was a period in which I wanted to be an actress, which I later realized was simply that I wanted to be applauded. I had no gift for theater at all. I had a good memory. I could memorize lines, but I was a very wooden performer. I was cleaving so hard to an evolving self. The idea of subordinating that self to a role was completely impossible. So my mother, with whom I was often at war in that period, kept saying, darling, darling, it's such a shame you want to be an actress because you're such a fine writer and painter. And she left the rest unsaid, and that made me more stubborn. But that was very brief. And then I went back to what I dreamed of. I mean, I didn't know what you did to become a writer with a book, but I wrote poems from the time I was in my early teens. I submitted my first book when I was 13 or 14. Of course, sent back. And poems to magazines. And I persisted.
Yes, and then life is not a bed of roses. It's not always a happy journey, as we know, and it is more true in case of Louise Glück. Her teenage had been a period of suffering and cocoon life, and it is an unimaginable suffering, probably when we peep into her life. When she was in high school, she entered her teenage, she had anorexia, a lack of appetite, and which continued for almost 7 years, because of which she had to give up her high school. She had to stay at home, and for 7 years she imprisoned almost in a room, and her body was totally different from others, but she decided to be a pure soul. This period of suffering, especially in the teenage, made her understand many realities. Realities related to the reactions of the family members, and in most of the poems she expresses it. Although we call her a straightforward writer, a very reflective expression of her teenage experiences of suffering have been articulated in a very reflective way. And gladly, she found a psychoanalyst who helped her overcome her challenges. For 7 years, she was at home, and later she goes to college in Columbia, Lawrence College and Columbia. There, it's all the miracle of teaching and teachers. And there she meets wonderful teachers who are her mentors too, Leonie Adams and Stanley Kunitz. These two individuals make her what she is. She herself confesses. And Leonie Adams soaked Louise Glück in poetry workshops. She took her to most of the poetry workshops and asked her to recite her poems and listen to others and find what exactly she would do in the days to come. And Stanley Kunitz continued that. And in her college, she started earning for her expenditure. She worked as a secretary to be self-dependent, and later she joined Goddard College to teach. And what she learned from her mentors, she passes on the same to the younger generation. It is, even today, she loves to read and guide young writers, and it's said that she has written forewords to many promising young voices. She prefers not to be a poet within quotes or ism poet, like existential, feminist, progressive. She doesn't want to be branded under any one of that, but she blends reality, nature, mythology, imagination in unique proportions. And her contribution to poetry, as mentioned earlier, she has published around 12 anthologies, and now it is 13. And her contributions to other genres of literature is also there. And we have got a few omnibus editions of Louise Glück and chapbooks and prose collections too. And in addition to that, prose collections. She has also written a few criticisms which have been published in some of the major magazines. And major themes of Louise Glück are autobiographical, confessional, reflective to evoke sense and sensibility, blended with reality, mythology, and nature. And disappointment, rejection, loss, sense of isolation, these are all the recurring themes of Louise Glück, and basic concerns are betrayal, morality, love, and sense of loss that accompanies it. She is at the heart of a poet of a fallen world, is the remark made by Stephen Burt. And although we say confessional writer, we have a few confessional writers from India too, especially Kamala Das. Kamala Das is almost too open in her confession, but when it comes to Louise Glück, she is highly balanced, reflectively confessional writer. And with all these themes in her works, throughout we can see these themes continuously recurring, and she representing most of her life and thoughts and experiences rather than a lot of imagination or a lot of creative other exploration. She explores language and creation in thought, but when it comes to emotions, she leans on to experiences of life. And as it's already mentioned, and the Google gives us all those lists, she has won a number of awards and rewards for her literature and individual books, and her collective poetry has got a lot of recognition. But I would like to draw your attention to one of her own remarks a few years ago, where regarding winning without race, she says, "It's very difficult to win. It's not in my script," Louise Glück said, but she won Nobel. And probably it is time for me to conclude, where to conclude, I take resort to her own lines. "I think here, I will leave. I leave you. It has come to seem there is no perfect ending. Indeed, there are infinite endings. Or perhaps, once one begins, there are only endings." With that, I conclude, but I think this should open a few more doors for us to explore more and more of Louise Glück. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gururaj. That was a very elaborate peep into her academic career and her writing career. I'm sorry about the connectivity that I suffered earlier, but we are going to invite the questions at the end of the session, which is after the three speakers have spoken. And now I invite Dr. Bhumika Sharma, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Central University of Rajasthan in India. Her research interest includes gender studies, Indian English literature, post-colonial literature, and African-American writing. She is the author of the African-American Journey to the Power Dome, Wright, Ellison, and Baldwin. She has co-authored 2 books. She's a very prolific researcher and has around 35 publications as research articles and book chapters in various anthologies and journals. I think something of remarkable interest includes her article in the Indian literature published by Sahitya Academy, and Journal of African American Studies published by Springer, USA, and Epiphany, Journal of Transdisciplinary Studies, published by International University of Sarajevo, Bosnia. She has spoken at many prestigious forums, and we feel happy to be her audience today. The jury for the Nobel Prize praised Louise Glück for her unmistakable poetic voice that, with austere beauty, makes individual existence universal. Dr. Bhumika will talk about that unmistakable poetic voice. Welcome, Dr. Bhumika. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamani. It's definitely a wonderful opportunity for me to speak on Louise Glück, the great poet, today on this platform, that ELTAI platform, which is a very renowned platform there across India, in fact, outside and abroad also. I would like to share my slides. Yeah, thank you so much. As Dr. Kamani has pointed out, that today I would be focusing more on the unmistakable poetic voice, because that is a very specific quality which is pointed out specifically by the panel when such an award was bestowed upon Louise Glück. My co-panelist, Dr. S. Gurraj, has already introduced the poet very elaborately, and he has mentioned the works which she has produced, which has, of course, international acclaim, and her name now doesn't require any introduction further. So I would be focusing on her poetic quality that actually classifies her poetry or her poetic style as as unmistakable voice that perhaps nobody can miss, because it has so much intensity, it has such grace, it has such a wonderful lyrical quality that nobody can just miss out that perhaps I should say that charm which lies there in the poetry itself as a genre. Her poetry is known and is appreciated for her technical precision, the sensitivity which is writ large in her poems, that insight into loneliness which every human being can connect to, because it comes out of heart and it gets connected with the universe. So this connection between the personal and the universe, that has been a great quality which great poets have always used in their expressions, and American literary tradition itself has been an example of that. So we can place Louise Glück in the tradition of American literature, and if we see in terms of the women writers, although she has passed gender and she has passed the national boundaries, but still if we connect her to that American literary tradition and the women poet, then we would find that she perhaps somewhere can be located in the tradition of Emily Dickinson, who was an early 19th century in America, and then the contemporary, that is the 20th century poet Sylvia Plath. So we have somewhere this tradition which is being carried forward by Louise Glück. Major themes which she has touched upon is like family relationship, death, mortality, and that universal connection, the spiritual awakening, that enlightenment. All these are wonderfully presented by her in her unmistakable poetic voice. So this is something that makes her poetic voice unmistakable, that is how she extends that individual to universal, how she converts her personal experiences, as Dr. S. Gurraj has pointed out, that her theme includes that autobiographical element which she has used to speak about universal truth. So how she converts that personal truth, the personal experience, into universal, that actually makes her a poet who stands apart. I would like to read out some poems, some excerpts and some extracts that would give you the feel of what Louise Glück poetry is, how it touches your heart. So I would quote a few lines from the early poetic collections like the Wild Iris, and then a few lines and a poem I would take up from her later collection. That would again give you some glimpse, because I have limited time, so I would like to give you the glimpse that how she has journeyed long in her career, how she started, and gradually the depth of her poetic quality got intensified, and then we have its reflection in her literary journey, in her poetic journey, that start from her early anthologies to the latest one, like The Faithful and Virtuous Night, that is the latest collection. So let me read from the earlier collection, The Wild Iris, which was published in 1992. In this anthology, we find that all poems are spoken by flowers. You know, we have the voices. And one of the critics has very nicely pointed out once that how Louise Glück writes, she actually gives you the voices. So you can see that there are characters around which she builds her poetic world. And these are not just the characters, they are actually the voices. And these voices bring out the dialectics of life. They bring out the contrariness and the contradictions of life. These voices bring out the intensity of the life as lived by us. And around that, she builds her poetry, and then we come out with experiences that speak for themselves. So there is a poetic persona, there is a poetic voice which is speaking, but we can very conveniently, very easily, very comfortably connect to that voice, can understand the dialectics. As it is stated that, you know, there is some kind of emotional intensity that that charms you, that allows you, that you takes you, you know, along with you, and then you feel mesmerized. So Louise Glück's poetry actually demonstrates that. So this is the poem drawn from The Wild Iris, where the speaker is the red poppy, the flower. I'll read out. The great thing is not having a mind. Feelings? Oh, I have those. They govern me. I have a Lord in heaven called the sun, and open for him, showing him the fire of my own heart, fire like his presence. What could such glory be if not a heart? Oh, my brothers and sisters, were you like me once, long ago, before you were human? Did you permit yourselves to open once who would never open again? Because in truth, I'm speaking now the way you do. I speak because I'm shattered. So here we have the speaker, that is a red poppy, that is a flower, and that is making connection with the sun, the Lord, which is present there in the sky. Now this red poppy is made to bloom, you know, it opens when the sunlight falls upon it. And when it opens, it would like to show its heart to the sun. This is the connection between that object that lies in the nature on earth, and then the divinity which is exhibited in that rays which are coming out of the sun. So this is the connection. This is the spiritual or divine element that is connecting one natural object with somewhere in the ethereal world, you know, something which is there on the earth and something which is there in the sky. So the red poppy opens its heart and then shows it to the sun, and the sun can see that energy, that power, that intensity. So this is the emotional intensity that enables an earthly object to connect to the universe, to connect to a divine power which is lying above. So this way you can see that how the personal experience, why I'm saying personal experience, because you can see it's a first person voice, I, the speaker. And in most of Glück's poetry, you would find that there is one I. Now this I takes a shape when it becomes a voice. It can be a mythological character, it can be a person, the speaker, the poet oneself, or it may be some object, which is actually the image drawn from the poem itself. So this is, you know, the glimpse of her early poetry, because in her later poetry, we find longer poems, which she calls book-length narratives. See, there's wonderful thing to understand here, to, you know, note down here, book-length narratives. The first thing, book-length, you know, they becomes longer, because Glück says that in the beginning when she wrote 15 lines, and then she thought perhaps whatever she wanted to say, she had already said. But as she continues her poetic journey, then she realizes that this one voice is not suffice. She needs the answer, because the voice actually poses questions, and then there is a need to answer to that voice. So there is a craving, there's a desire to evoke that dialectic, which would make dialogue possible. And so she switched to, you know, this one speaker, to the dialectic of various voices, you know, one multiplying into 2, then again more than 2, and then we have the dialectic, the dialogue that occurs in Gluck's poetry. So I would come to that in the the later readings, but let me continue with that. Okay, it's not showing. Yeah, I think I have missed one slide. Anyways, I'll then go ahead with this. The Myth of Innocence, because there is another poem from the Wild Iris in which we have another speaker, that is the blue flower, the wild iris. And in that poem, the poet is actually talking about her crossing the boundary and entering into the domain of death, the darkness, the stillness that enlightens her, that again gives you the idea of the rebirth, that how it is possible to enter into the darkness, that mysticism, and come back. So as that poem was not visible on the slide, so I'm just giving you the gist of it. So the journey continues, as I have pointed out 2 poems from the collection Wild Iris. Now I'm coming to her comparatively later collection, that is AVERNO. It has a lot of mythological references, mythological characters, but as my co-panelist, Dr. Vanna, would be talking about the mythological dimension of her poetry, that's why I would not focus on this mythological dimension, but I would like to tell you that how she addresses various themes in her poetry where she includes these mythological characters. Because again, these mythological characters are the voices. And we find that they are individuals, but then they are placed in the social context. And these social contexts make the person realize the inner relationship, the relationship with the self, that makes Louise Glück's poetry quite deep, and then the social context which connect the person with the outer world. So let me read out one excerpt from The Myth of Innocence, which is drawn from the AVERNO, because it's a long poem, so I'm not reading out the entire poem. I'm just reading out one extract. Here the situation which is created by the poet in this particular poem is that we have this mythological character of Persephone. Now she is coming back and standing beside the pool, and she's looking at the pool, and then she starts thinking about that. When I read the starting line, I think you yourself can trace that dialectic which I'm talking about, which is so much frequent in Gluck's poetry. See, Persephone is the person, the speaker, the voice which features in this poem, and she stands by the pool. So that is the situation created. I'll read. She stands by the pool saying, "From time to time, I was abducted." But it sounds wrong to her, nothing like what she felt. Then she says, "I was not abducted." Then she says, "I offered myself. I wanted to escape my body. Even sometimes I will this." But ignorance cannot will knowledge. Ignorance wills something imagined, which it believes exists. All the different nouns, she says them in rotation. Death, husband, God, stranger. Everything sounds so simple, so conventional. I must have been, she thinks, a simple girl. She can't remember herself as the person, but she keeps thinking the pool will remember and explain to her the meaning of her prayer, so she can understand whether it was answered or not. In this extract, you can see that the poetic voice, the Persephone as the character, she is referring to her dilemma, the dialectics, the contrariness which she experiences. She feels she was abducted, and then she comes with the counterpoint that she was not abducted, she offered herself. So this is basically the ambivalence or the dilemma that constitute the life experiences of the human beings. We all, and that's why the Gluck's poetic thought becomes universal. There's a kind of movement shift from the personal to the universal. So this is the dialectic which is evoked there in this particular stanza, and we find that what actually this voice is thinking about, Persephone is thinking about. She is thinking about the innocence which she has lost because that relates to her childhood. So when she's standing at the pool and she's thinking about the past, the childhood when she was such a simple girl, and then the present time when she is abducted by the Hades, that is, of course, who took her along with him, and then she entered into the dark world of Hades. So that was a journey from the childhood to adulthood. So there's a craving
Dr.
to go
Bhumika,
back.
I'll have to interrupt you.
Yeah, okay.
We need to give some time to the
Okay.
third speaker, so we'll need you to wind up. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So then I'll just read this last excerpt that is titled as A Foreshortened Journey. Why I'm reading it? Because that will again show you that how she shifted from the lyrical poems to the prose poems. I'll just read it out. I found the stairs somewhat more difficult than I had expected, and so I sat down, so to speak, in the middle of the journey, because there was a large window opposite the railing. I was able to entertain myself with the little dramas and comedies of the street outside, though no one I knew passed by, no one, certainly, who could have assisted me, nor were the stairs themselves in use as far as I could see. You must get up, my lad, I told myself. Since this seemed suddenly impossible, I did the next best thing. I prepared to sleep. My head and arms on the stair above, my body crouched below. Sometimes after this, a little girl appeared at the top of the staircase, holding the hand of an elderly woman. Grandmother, cried the little girl, there's a dead man on the staircase. We must let him sleep, said the grandmother. We must walk quietly by. He's at that point in life at which neither returning to the beginning nor advancing to the end seems bearable. Therefore, he has decided to stop here in the midst of the things, though this makes him an obstacle to others such as ourselves. But we must not give up hope. In my own life, she continued, there was such a time, though that was long ago. And here she let her grandmother walk in front of her so they could pass me without disturbing me. I would have liked to hear the whole of her story, since she seemed, as she passed by, a vigorous woman, ready to take pleasure in life, and at the same time forthright, without illusions. But soon their voices faded into whisper, or they were far away. Will we see him when we return? The child murmured. He will be long gone by then, said her grandmother. He will have finished climbing up or down, as the case may be. Then I'll say goodbye now, said the girl, and she knelt below me, chanting a prayer I recognized as the Hebrew prayer for the dead. Sir, she whispered, my grandmother tells me you're not dead, but I thought perhaps this would soothe you in your terrors, and I will not be here to sing it at the right time. When you hear this again, she said, perhaps the words will be less intimidating if you remember how you first heard them in the voice of a little girl. So this is the extract drawn from Faithful and Virtuous Night, and this is an example of a prose poem where she becomes more subtle in giving you the depth of the life, its experiences, as she says, the foreshortened journey. So I'll just conclude as we have limited time. So I would say in the brief that her poetic themes includes trauma, survival. She comments on the opinion and she gives the explanation about the event, expresses desires. There is nature imagery used by her. There is autobiographical element used by her. There is a sense of in-betweenness. There is sense of spiritual witnessing, which she shows in her poems. And her poetic style is marked with the careful diction, the rhythm, the autobiographical element, and the psychoanalysis, where the self listens to what it is left into the dreams and illusions. So we have the unmistakable poetic voice, which has very candid and uncompromising tone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bhumika. I'm so sorry that time is always a limitation. I'm so sorry. Next, we have Dr. Vandana Sharma, who's an associate professor and head Department of English, Central University of Jammu. Her interest chiefly lies in translation studies, gender studies, post-colonial writing, and Indian English literature. She has presented papers in numerous national and international conferences and has published 5 important books. Some of them are translations from Dogri to English. Her translation of Sahitya Academy awarded short stories Dudh Lahu Zeher has been published by Sahitya Academy New Delhi, entitled Waiting for Neelkant and Other Stories. I'm not going to go into a very elaborate introduction because that will eat into her time. I think I should just welcome her and ask her to take the stage from here. Dr. Vandana Sharma.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamayani. It's indeed a pleasure to be here at this stellar platform, I must say, and to be speaking on a writer of this depth, profundity, and magnitude, Louise Glück. So I'm glad that being the last speaker, I have the privilege. I can skip on certain points. I can carry forward. My co-panelists, they have already deliberated over her thematic concerns, on her biography at the same time. And here I am. And I would like to begin and carry forward, as Dr. Bhumika just mentioned, Louise Glück's unmistakable poetic voice. And what is important is the beauty with which she makes the individual experience universal. And my all compliments to the ELTAI webinar series for taking up this author, because as Dr. Gururaj also mentioned, and we understand that to be deliberating and discussing a writer who has been awarded Nobel Prize just a couple of months back is indeed a great pleasure and privilege. I would just touch upon Louise Glück's oeuvre. Faithful and Virtuous Night has already been talked about, has already been deliberated by Dr. Bhumika. And as we know that by this time that Louise Glück's oeuvre comprises of 12 books of poetry, including the recent collection, which is Faithful and the Virtuous Night, which has been awarded National Book Award, and poems from 1962 to 2012. In a nutshell, we can see that Louise Glück's poems, such as The Firstborn, The House on Marshland, The Garden, Descending Figure, The Triumph of Achilles, Ararat, and the Pulitzer Prize winning The Wild Iris, which has been read by Dr. Bhumika. However, since I'm going to look at the mythological undercurrents in the poetry of Louise Glück, I would be looking at two of her most important poems, which is Meadowlands and AVERNO. Daniel Morris traces the wide range of Glück's poetry when he says, from the persona poem to a blunt confessionalism to dialogue to a kind of mock epic that, like Joyce's Ulysses, regards the author's life, however, ironized through a Homeric template, because she composes her poetry from a mosaic of multicultural resources. Glück has appealed to critics representing diverse, often diametrically opposed communities of interpretation. What's interesting to note is that Glück's revisionist myth-making, because poetry has always been a handmaiden of mythology and vice versa. Sometimes poets are in the business of collecting and tweaking existing myths, as with Ovid's Metamorphoses and Poetic Edda. Other times poetry applies a mythological glamour to stories and characters from history, legend, or even myths for that matter. So it is interesting to note that the relationship between poetry and mythology is central to Louise Glück's, and no poet of Glück's generation has relied so heavily, so overtly on mythology as Philip Larkin once called the common myth kitty. So that's probably inevitable because Glück has always favored abstraction over particularity. From the beginning, she has written lines that are almost completely devoid of the kind of chatty reportage and pop cultural name dropping that have been very common in American poetry. First first of all, I'll shortly dwell over the mythic to the modern in Meadowlands. Meadowlands as a collection, here Louise Glück in Meadowland explores the shaky marital landscape that her earlier work, The Wild Iris, addressed. The book-length sequence juxtaposes, reinterprets, and illuminates an array of voices, both contemporary and epic, by interweaving them together throughout the collection. The backdrop for the sequence is Homer's Odyssey, where evocations of the story of Penelope and Odysseus shadow the breakup of a contemporary divorcing couple. Penelope in Greek mythology is celebrated for her faithfulness, for her patience, and for her feminine virtue, and is the most enduring version of Greek myth. Circe, on the other hand, in Meadowlands, is a sequence and a series of parables. So Glück intertwines these small series rather than clustering each group in complete linear threads, so that each of the perspectives are constantly responding to and expounding on each other. In addition to these sequences found within the larger work, Glück includes a series of kitchen sink dialogue poems and epistles written in the voices of contemporary husband and wife that are also woven around the mythic speakers. Now here I would like to look at the two poems from this collection of Meadowlands, Quiet Evening and Purple Bathing Suit. The feminine perspective is divided among Circe and Saran as the other woman, contrasted with the opposing forces of Penelope and the modern woman as the wife. The masculine perspective of the husband in regard to this departure and the infidelities is chiefly reflected in the parallel she draws between contemporary husband and Odysseus. But the tally matches mini sequence also provides a very unique outlook on the question of marriage and a falling relationship in his account of the parents. There is no formal pattern that Glück uses when ordering these poems, but she's certainly within the loose boundaries of the implied narrative, makes use of a general progression of the poems as a cohesive unit, moving from the apprehension and raw hostility of the earlier poems to the final poems that eventually come to acceptance. Now, Quiet Evening, one of the opening poems, here Glück writes in the voice of the wife in an epistle to her husband, saying, from this point on, the silence through which you move is my voice pursuing you. This hostile warning reveals the speaker's anxiety and distrustfulness toward her husband's departure, even though she never vocalizes her emotions in the poem. And much later in the sequence of the Purple Bathing Suit, the speaker again addresses her husband in an epistle. But this time, instead of hiding her own fears with a thinly veiled threat to make herself feel better, she shows signs of self-recognition through a moment of honesty, admitting to herself, as much as she wants that freedom from her husband, she's very much dependent on him at the same time. When she says, you are a small, irritating purple thing, and I would like to see you walk off the face of the earth, because you are all that's wrong with my life, and I need you and I claim you. As we move on, most of the last few poems in the sequence, namely The Dream, Otis, Heart's Desire, The Wish, Parable of Gift. So here the speaker's movement towards the acceptance of the marriage's end. Alongside these poems are The Wish, Parable of the Gift, which both concern finding personal happiness. And I think that these two threads running side by side is appropriate because for the speaker, recognition and acceptance brings a sense of peace, freedom in knowing that affection will triumph over passion. Now, for instance, a departure. Departure, one of the epistles written in the voice of the contemporary wife to her husband, is directly followed by Ithaka, a poem written in the omniscient voice that provides a more impersonal, distant account of the epic narrative. Departure presents a situation where the husband is leaving home, his destination unknown to the reader, and his wife is apprehensive about him being gone. Now, the poem shows the speaker's honest realism when presenting the complexities of the situation. She also shows a side of a last denial in wishing that her husband would just stay away with her a little longer, even though she's already adept at avoiding the heart. And Ithaka directly responds to this. The beloved doesn't need to live. The beloved lives in the head. So what we see here is that now the speaker claims that what she will remember from his departure is her husband's hands on the back of the chair. We know he will permeate her through thoughts, though whether they are nostalgic thoughts or parallels of Penelope's hypothesis, her husband's erotic life, it's not clarified here. Now, as we move on, it's very interesting to see.
We need some questions to be answered.
Okay.
If you could, because we're already out of time.
Okay, so what I can do is that I can quickly, I'll quickly in 2 minutes. So, you know, Circe and Penelope, that another very interesting twist, interesting, myth-making technique which she has employed in this poem is also very interesting to see. And as we move on to the mythological undercurrents in Averno, that becomes all the more important to see, because I will just run through my presentation because as I said earlier also, that the port of this, depth cannot be dealt, but it's really compliments to ELTAI. They have organized this webinar. So the myth of innocence is another where the story of Persephone and Hades and several of the major themes, including love, disappointment, they have been taken up. And moving on to the myth of devotion, which is a complex story that shows the comparison, the idea of love rather than the love for someone or something. So where she makes use of darkness as a representation of love and freedom. So as we move towards the conclusion, it is very important to realize and understand that we are living in quite unprecedented times, and it's really challenging to deliberate over the profundity, as I said, of Gluck's poetic genius. And what we realize is that as the world battles a stubborn pandemic, the Swedish Academy's pick is perhaps a reminder that amid mind-numbing uncertainties, there is art. And as is reflected for Miss Glück, as she said in one of her interviews in New York Times, I would like to conclude with that. The hope is that if you live through it, there will be art on the other side. There is an awakening after darkness, she appears to say in Snowdrops. And with this, we end, and we hope that the world comes out of the present darkness, which all of us are engulfed in one form or the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I now request Dr. Anita Sharma, who's President ELTAI Simla Chapter, to take us through the questions and also conclude the session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamaini, and it was really a wonderful, session with Dr. Gururaj, Dr. Bhumika Sharma, and Dr. Vandana Sharma, ma'am. We regret, for the time, limit which we had. Your discourses were so wonderful. It was not really, good to actually interrupt in between, but somehow we had to due to the time constraint. I think all the three speakers, they had actually talked about in detail about Louise Elizabeth Glück, poetry, and for which she has been, given Nobel Prize. I will just try to summarize whatever they, said in one or two, paragraphs. That is, they have told us that Glück is one of the America's most talented contemporary poets, who has won 2020 Nobel Prize in Literature, whose judges actually has praised her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal. And that is the thing, where we find in her poetry the technical precision and sensitivity, insight into her loneliness, her family relationships, divorce, and death, which I think even Dr. Gururaj sir has also talked. Her later work really continues, and they explore the agony of the self, which I think Vandana ma'am and Bhumika ma'am, they have tried to touch in their discourse. In her poems, the self listens actually what is left of its dreams and delusions, and nobody can be harder than she is in confronting the illusions of the self. She also talks about the voices of mythological, concerns like Dido, Persephone, Eurydice, even Homer and others, which Ma'am Vandana has, talked. The abandoned, the punished, the betrayed, which actually stand for the mask for the self in transformation in personal as well as on the universal, scale. Glick is often described as an autobiographical poet or a confessional, poet also due to her emotional intensity, and because she's often drawing her things from mythology or nature imagery, because she is actually meditating in a personal experience and with her modern life. A teacher of English at Yale University, Miss Glick has said that from poet Stanley Kunitz, she learned to subordinate her ego to the needs of the poem. The poet Cragg has described her as a writer for whom words are always scarce, hard won, and not to be wasted. And that's where she is having that lyrical, compression, which could bring her close to Emily Dickinson, to Elizabeth Bishop in American, poetry. Her relationship between life and death in her poetry actually talks about one important theme, that is desire. I think a generation after Walt Whitman, if we say, that declared, himself as the poet of the body and the poet of the soul, Glick too uncovers that spirit which is woven of sinew and the mind of the marrow. And she also talks about the emotional, trauma, the consciousness, without which she feels there is nothing. And yet, she says, we spend our lives turning away from this elemental fact with distraction, with addiction, and with the trance of busyness until suddenly something beyond our control, a diagnosis, a heart attack, or a pandemic, that staggers us awake. So, talking about this process, Miss Glick said she feels alive when she writes poetry. For her, writing is a kind of revenge against circumstances, as told by Dr. Gururaj sir, because she had gone through all the bad luck, loss, and pain during her teenage years. As the world today battles a stubborn pandemic COVID-19, as Kamini had began her discourse in the beginning, I think the Swedish Academy's pick is perhaps a reminder that amid mind-numbing uncertainties due to COVID, there is art with poetry, and when there is art, there is hope. So I think whole the thing I would like to conclude with her two quotations. One, which ma'am has also talked about, Bhumika ma'am. The great thing is not having a mind, feeling, oh, I have those, and they govern me. And the another quote is, the unsaid to me exerts great power. I think with this scenario of the poet Glick, and the discourses which we had from Dr. Bhumika Sharma ma'am and Dr. Vandana, as well as Dr. Gururaj, we had actually gone through her poetry. We had elaborate discourses on her biographical, academic, as well as the mythological world. Now I think let's come to the question answer session, and there are for all the three speakers, we have compliments. It's the chat box is full of compliments. A wonderful session, and people are thanking you all. Thank you so much to the wonderful speakers. And because we are not comfortable with the time thing, so according to Javier's, I must take up only few questions, and the questions are actually to all the three speakers. There is the first question which I have got on my WhatsApp now. Javier had forwarded it to me. Can we say that her poetic topics are close to Adrienne Rich? The question is by Dr. Suchita Chandok.
Yeah, I've already answered that question under public chat. Yes, they are almost very close, and not only to Adrienne Rich, but her poems are very much closer to Kamala Das or any other sensible writer who relies on real life experiences and facts of life.
Okay. There is another question by Uday Sankar Chaudhary sir, and he is asking, what is the impact of Greek mythology on our poems? I think Dr. Vandana has elaborated a lot on that. In fact, even in a limited, time span. Dr. Vandana, would you like to answer this one?
Totally. It's really, I was flabbergasted at the fact, as I was going through the poetic compositions of Louise Glück, I found that there have been not only the Greek mythology, even Roman mythology for that matter. So, majority of her poems, whether it is AVERNO, because due to paucity of time, I could just touch upon her major poetic compositions. So we find that there is very prominent, intermingling of the poetic and the mythic in her poetry, whether it is in AVERNO, whether it is the myth of Penelope and Hades, whether it is a myth from the Odysseus, right? So it's very interesting to see, and one can draw various she places the mythic and the modern. That juxtaposition of the mythic and the modern is very, very predominant in the poetic compositions of Louise Glück, of course.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have the last question now to all the speakers. Why is only her voice considered to be the unmistakable poetic voice when there are many other equally deserving of action?
Could you again read it, because I couldn't get the entire thing.
This is why is only her voice considered to be unmistakable poetic voice. Sorry. When there are many others who are equally deserving of that description.
Okay. So I would like to, respond to this query, very interesting query. That way, actually, it makes the, you can say, choice quite difficult for the panel or for the group of the people who are responsible for making a decision, especially with regard to the Nobel Prize. But, I would say that art has its own charm and its intensity and its strength. It allures you, it drives you towards your, oneself, and then you would realize that there is something, maybe if I call it an X factor. So this unmistakable X factor, perhaps if I say it in the contemporary language, or I would say that emotional intensity and that artistic element, when they are combined, although we cannot be the judge in a way, but the art manifests itself for its excellence. You must have heard about that Touchstone method, which Arnold suggested at one point of time. So there is something like the Touchstone that would tell you, that beauty of the work that perhaps makes it quite rewarding. And I don't doubt about the decision of the panel who decided to award her Nobel Prize, because when I went through her poetry, there's no doubt about it that it mesmerizes. And that's why perhaps, the jury must have stated the unmistakable voice. It makes you listen. Even if you don't want to, still it will allure you towards that. So there are many other talented writers also, but Louise Glück is no lesser than that. So in that case, I would see the element which is there, that art, that beauty, that intensity, that has capacity to make everybody connect to it, and then learn the depth of life in such precision, in using such economy of word, and then giving the greater truth. That is so wonderful in her writing that perhaps the jury must have decided not to, miss that, and that's why she becomes, unmistakable voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you to all the speakers. Now, let me, propose a formal thanks. ELTAI Shimla chapter, on behalf of ELTAI Shimla chapter, we are really very grateful and full of gratitude to the president of ELTAI, Professor Sanjay Arora, sir, for giving us this opportunity and this platform. My heartfelt thanks to all our eminent speakers, Dr. Gururaj S., Dr. Bhumika Sharma, and Dr. Vandana Sharma. And my special thanks to the moderator, ma'am, Dr. Kamaini. I'm also grateful to the director of the webinar, Dr. Mohan Raj sir, who was with us and who has to leave the meeting. And especially to our technical expert, without whom it wouldn't have been possible, Dr. Javiers. Thank you so much. And also in the last is all the office bearers and the members of the ELTAI, especially Professor Shravan, Professor Ramani, Professor Ilango. We are thankful to you all. And my special thanks to all the participants and all those people who actually raised queries and they actually participated into the discussion. Thank you so much, friends, to be with us. And I'm happy to share with you all that we had international participants also with us. I found chats coming up and giving up the compliments from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Indonesia, and some other countries also. Thank you so much, friends, for joining us over here. Now, on behalf of ELTAI, we have certain announcements which are to be presented for our future endeavors. Allow me to share those. I hope Javier, you are going to help me with that. Thank you so much. Our next webinar will be held at 4:30 p.m. IST on 6th December on the topic Teaching Poetry Effectively by Dr. Partha Sarthi Mishra, Faculty Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. The registration link is available in the chat box. Regional English Language Office, RELO, New Delhi brings you a unique opportunity of attending an Facebook live event on the comprehension hypothesis 45 years later. But the renowned subject expert, Dr. Stephen Krishan, joined the Facebook live session at 5 p.m. IST on November 23. The link to RELO's Facebook page is available in the chat box. From 20th December 2020 onwards, we will issue certificates of participation only to the members of ELTAI who attend our webinars. However, our webinars will continue to be open for anyone to attend without any registration fee. If you are not a member of ELTAI, we request you to take membership as soon as possible. Your membership will enable us to conduct more professional development programs in the future. The link to membership form is available in the chat box. So these are the announcements on behalf of ELTAI, English Language Teachers Association of India. We are all thankful to you all. Thank you so much and goodbye. Good evening to all of you.